The night I cashed out my business for $73 million, my house swelled with laughter and clinking glasses. The air buzzed with congratulations. And then, just before the toast, I saw something colder. My daughter-in-law, leaning close, slipped something into my drink. I didn't flinch. I didn't scold. I simply smiled, raised the glass as if nothing had happened, and when the room erupted in cheers, I switched it with her father's. And then, only moments later, the celebration froze. If you want to know what real justice looks like, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. The Westchester estate gleamed under crystal chandeliers that evening, every surface polished to mirror perfection for this moment I'd worked 40 years to achieve. The scent of aged wood and expensive cologne filled the great room as business partners mingled, their practiced smiles familiar after decades of negotiations. My son Mitchell stood near the fireplace, swaying slightly, that vacant look in his eyes that had become his signature over the past few years. Strange how a brilliant lawyer could fade so quickly into someone who struggled to remember his own cases. The doctors found nothing definitive, running test after test. But I knew better. A father always knows when something's eating away at his child, even when he can't name it yet. The warmth from the fireplace couldn't reach the cold worry that had settled in my chest months ago. Sloane moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her emerald dress catching the light as she refilled champagne flutes with the dedication of a perfect hostess. She'd always been attentive, perhaps too attentive, the kind of daughter-in-law who remembered every birthday, every preference, every small detail that made you feel seen and cared for. Her father Vernon followed her movements from across the room, adjusting his tie repeatedly, a nervous habit I'd noticed at every family gathering. There was something in the way he positioned himself, always within earshot of her conversations, that struck me as unusual. The leather of his shoes creaked as he shifted his weight, tracking her path through the room. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite place, a pattern I'd seen but hadn't consciously registered. The champagne sparkled in crystal flutes, Dom Perignon vintage that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, waiting for the moment when we'd toast to new beginnings. The bubbles rose steadily, tiny spheres of light catching the chandelier's glow. $73 million tends to make people generous with their attention. And tonight, everyone wanted to be part of my success story. They didn't know that for weeks now, I'd been feeling strange. Dizzy spells that came from nowhere, leaving me gripping furniture for support. Memory gaps that lasted minutes, sometimes hours, like pieces of film cut from a reel. The same symptoms I'd watched creep over Mitchell, only milder, more controlled, as if someone was testing dosages on a new subject. The taste of metal lingered in my mouth on the worst mornings, a flavor I couldn't explain. My doctor ran tests but found nothing conclusive. Yet every morning after Sloane brought me my special tea, that fog would descend. Subtle but persistent, like breathing through wet cotton. I was standing by the bay window, watching the sun paint the manicured gardens gold and crimson, when Sloane approached with a fresh glass of champagne. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm I'd heard 1,000 times. Her smile was warm, maternal almost, as she pressed the crystal flute into my hand. The glass was cold against my palm, condensation already forming. "For the man of the hour," she said, her fingers briefly touching mine. That's when I saw it. A quick movement, practiced and smooth, as her other hand passed over the glass. Something small and white dissolved instantly into the golden bubbles, disappearing like it had never existed. If I hadn't been watching for it, if 40 years in business hadn't taught me to watch hands instead of faces during negotiations, I would have missed it entirely. But I saw it all. And in that moment, pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed began shifting into place. Vernon stood to my left, his own champagne untouched, that peculiar tension in his shoulders he always carried when Sloane was serving drinks to others. The silk of his pocket square had been adjusted so many times it was crumpled. Mitchell had started his toast, his words slurring slightly as he praised my business acumen. The room's attention focused entirely on him. The sound of glasses gently clinking provided a musical backdrop to his speech. It was perfect timing, really. While everyone watched my son struggle through sentences that once would have flowed like water, I created a natural movement that brought me closer to Vernon. The crowd's laughter at Mitchell's attempted joke covered any sound as our positions shifted. In one smooth motion, unnoticed in the general movement of bodies adjusting to see the speaker better, our glasses changed places. Vernon, distracted by staring at something across the room, never noticed. The champagne looked identical, the bubbles rising in both glasses like tiny secrets, desperate to reach the surface. Vernon drank deeply when the toast was called, the kind of satisfied gulp of a man celebrating another's fortune. I pretended to sip, letting the liquid touch my lips without swallowing, the taste sharp and wrong somehow. The room erupted in congratulations, voices overlapping in a chaos of well wishes, but I kept my eyes on Vernon. 5 minutes passed as people returned to their conversations. Then 10. The color in his face, already flushed from the warmth of the crowded room, began to drain away like water from a sink. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air conditioning humming softly through the vents. His hand trembled as he set down his glass, the crystal ringing against the marble table. I saw the moment panic flashed in his eyes, pupils dilating as his body recognized something was terribly wrong. He tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound before his knees buckled. The crash of his body hitting the marble floor silenced the room more effectively than any announcement could have. Sloane's scream cut through the shocked silence, high and sharp, but there was something off about it, like a note played slightly flat. She rushed to Vernon's side, her dress pooling around her as she knelt, cradling his head in her lap. Her fingers stroked his face with movements that seemed too familiar, too practiced, as if she'd done this before. "Call an ambulance!" she shouted, though her eyes weren't looking at Vernon's distressed face. They were scanning the room, searching for something or someone. When they landed on me still holding my champagne glass, I saw confusion flicker across her features. She looked at my glass, then at Vernon's abandoned one on the side table, and I watched her try to piece together what had gone wrong with whatever plan she'd had. The EMTs arrived within minutes, their efficient movements transforming my celebration into a medical emergency. The sharp smell of antiseptic cut through the party atmosphere as they worked. Vernon's vitals were erratic, his pupils dilated, classic signs of sedative overdose. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, the wheels squeaking against the marble, I heard Sloane whisper something in his ear. She leaned so close her hair brushed his face, lips barely moving. "Not you. This wasn't meant for you." The words were soft, desperate, meant only for Vernon, but I'd positioned myself perfectly to catch them. The ambiguity of it lingered in the air. Not meant for him, but for whom? The kind of concern that could mean anything or everything. Mitchell stood in the corner, confused and swaying, relying on the wall for support. The wallpaper's texture seemed to fascinate him as he traced patterns only he could see. My brilliant son, who'd graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, who'd once argued cases before state Supreme Courts, now couldn't process what was happening in his own home. Celeste, my ex-wife and Mitchell's mother, had arrived late to the party. She watched our son with tears gathering in her eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth. She'd been telling me for months that something was wrong with him, that he wasn't the same man anymore. The worry in her voice had become a constant refrain. I'd dismissed it as the stress of his career, but now, watching him struggle to focus on the chaos around him, I realized how blind I'd been. Or maybe not blind. Maybe I'd been seeing it all along but refusing to acknowledge what it meant. The party dissolved quickly after the ambulance left, guests making excuses and hasty exits, uncomfortable with the drama that had interrupted their evening of wealth and sophistication. Car engines started in quick succession, headlights sweeping across the windows as people fled. Sloane played the perfect hostess even in crisis, thanking people for coming, assuring them Vernon would be fine. Her composure never cracking, except for the slight tremor in her hands, when she thought no one was looking. She cleaned up methodically, her movements automatic, gathering glasses with mechanical precision. I noticed she palmed something from the kitchen counter, a small bottle that disappeared into her pocket with the same smooth motion I'd seen earlier, the same practiced light of hand that had almost poisoned me. As the house emptied and silence settled over the rooms that had been so full of life just an hour before, I stood at the window again, looking out at the gardens now bathed in moonlight. The shadows of trees stretched across the lawn like reaching fingers. The champagne glass still sat on the table, the bubbles long gone flat, a monument to a celebration that had become something else entirely. Sloane's heels clicked on the marble as she approached, each step measured and careful. I could feel her eyes studying my face, searching for something. "It's been a long night," she said carefully, her voice steady but thin. "You should get some rest. I'll go check on Dad at the hospital." The way she said Dad sounded forced, like she was reminding herself of the role she was supposed to be playing, a script she'd momentarily forgotten. I nodded, playing the part of the concerned but tired patriarch, my shoulders sagging with apparent exhaustion. "Give Vernon my best," I said, watching her face for any reaction. There it was, just for a moment, a flash of something dark in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or calculation. The muscles in her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew something had gone wrong with her plan, but she couldn't figure out what. As she gathered her things, the soft rustle of fabric and clicking of her purse clasp filling the silence, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would start digging into the truth about Sloane and Vernon. Tonight had shown me there were secrets in my family, poisonous ones that were slowly destroying everything I'd built. The $73 million I'd earned suddenly seemed less like a triumph and more like bait in a trap I was only beginning to understand. The switched glasses sat between us like an unspoken question, one that would need answering soon. The morning after the celebration, Presbyterian Hospital's sterile corridors seemed to stretch endlessly as I made my way to Vernon's room. The ICU hummed with mechanical rhythms of life support machines and monitoring equipment, a symphony of modern medicine keeping death at bay. Vernon had survived the night, though the doctors said it was touch and go for several hours. Massive dose of lorazepam, they told me, enough to kill someone with a weaker constitution. The kind of dose that wasn't accidental, wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate attempt to incapacitate or worse. I wondered if Sloane had miscalculated the amount, or if the dose that nearly killed her father had been carefully measured for someone else entirely, someone who'd been receiving smaller doses for weeks to build up just enough tolerance to survive the final strike. Sloane sat beside Vernon's bed when I arrived, her hand wrapped around his in a grip that spoke more of possession than concern. She'd been there all night, the nurses told me, refusing to leave even when they suggested she get some rest. Her dedication would have been touching if I hadn't noticed how her thumb traced circles on his wrist, the kind of unconscious, intimate gesture that lovers share when they think no one's watching. Vernon's eyes were open but unfocused, the drugs in his system keeping him in a twilight state between consciousness and sleep. When he saw me, something like fear flickered across his face before Sloane squeezed his hand, and he relaxed again. They had their own silent language, these two, built from years of something I was only beginning to understand. The attending physician pulled me aside to discuss Vernon's condition. The amount of lorazepam in his blood was consistent with an attempted murder, she said carefully, watching my reaction. Did Vernon have any enemies? Was he depressed? The questions came with professional detachment, but I could see her real concern. This wasn't a typical overdose. This was something deliberate and calculated. I told her about the party, about the champagne, leaving out the crucial detail of the switched glasses. Let them think about what they wanted. I needed time to understand what I was dealing with before involving authorities who might bungle the investigation or alert Sloane to how much I really knew. The doctor made notes, her expression troubled, and mentioned they'd need to report this to the police as a potential poisoning. Mitchell arrived an hour later, moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating through fog. My son looked older than his 38 years, his once sharp features now slack with whatever poison had been slowly fed to him over the years. He kissed Sloane's cheek, a gesture so automatic it seemed more muscle memory than affection, then slumped into a chair by the window. I watched him try to focus on a magazine, his eyes sliding over the words without comprehension. This was what 10 years of marriage to Sloane had done to him. 10 years of special tease, loving care, and slow deterioration that everyone attributed to stress or early onset of some undiagnosed condition. But now, seeing Vernon in that bed, knowing what Sloane had tried to do to me, the pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. Sloane stood to get coffee, suggesting Mitchell and I keep Vernon company. The moment she left, Vernon's entire demeanor changed. His eyes, suddenly alert and focused, locked onto mine with an intensity that belied his supposed sedation. He tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper that Mitchell, lost in his own medicated haze, didn't even notice. I leaned closer, pretending to adjust Vernon's blanket, and heard him rasp out words that chilled me. Something about Margaret, about 5 years ago, about Sloane being special. The words were fragmented, confused, but there was desperation in them, as if he knew this might be his only chance to confess something that had been eating at him. Before I could process what he was trying to tell me, Sloane returned, and Vernon's eyes went dull again, the mask sliding back into place. The way Sloane moved around that hospital room revealed more than any confession could. She knew exactly where everything was, moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent significant time in medical settings. When a nurse came to check Vernon's IV, Sloane watched with professional interest, asking questions about dosages and interactions that went beyond normal concern. She'd worked at Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital before marrying Mitchell. She'd mentioned once at a dinner party, though she'd been vague about why she left. Now, watching her assess Vernon's medical chart with practiced eyes, I wondered what exactly her role there had been, and why she'd really left. The nurse seemed uncomfortable with Sloane's questions, especially when she asked about specific sedatives and their long-term effects on cognitive function. Celeste arrived in the afternoon, bringing flowers and genuine concern that contrasted sharply with the calculated performance Sloane had been giving. My ex-wife had always been perceptive, one of the reasons our marriage had ended. She saw too much, understood too much, and couldn't live with the moral compromises I made building my fortune. Now she studied our son with worried eyes, then looked at Sloane and Vernon with something approaching suspicion. She pulled me into the hallway, her voice low and urgent. Mitchell was getting worse, she said. Last week he'd forgotten their lunch appointment 3 times, couldn't remember his own phone number when asked. The progression was accelerating. Whatever was happening to him was reaching a critical stage, and she was scared we were going to lose him entirely if we didn't act soon. I suggested Celeste take Mitchell home, get him away from the hospital's oppressive atmosphere. Sloane protested, saying Mitchell should stay with family during this difficult time, but there was an edge to her voice that made me insist. As Celeste led our confused son away, I saw Sloane's mask slip for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. She didn't want Mitchell out of her sight, out of her control. The thought struck me that maybe Mitchell's condition wasn't just about inheriting his share of my fortune. Maybe it was about keeping him docile, compliant, unable to question what was happening in his own home. A drugged husband wouldn't notice if his wife's relationship with her father crossed boundaries that should never be crossed. The afternoon sun slanted through the hospital windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the unnatural tableau of Sloane and Vernon. She'd pulled her chair close to his bed, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that excluded the rest of the world. When she thought I was reading emails on my phone, she leaned down and whispered in Vernon's ear, her lips brushing against his skin with disturbing familiarity. His hand came up to touch her face, fingers trailing along her jaw, in a caress that made my stomach turn. This wasn't a daughter comforting her father. This was something else entirely, something that explained the intensity of their connection, the strange dynamics I'd observed but dismissed over the years. They were hiding in plain sight, using their biological relationship as cover for something unspeakable. An elderly nurse who'd been at Presbyterian for decades stopped by to check on Vernon. She recognized Sloane, her face lighting up with surprise. They'd worked together years ago, she said, back when Sloane was at Willowbrook. The nurse's expression shifted as she continued, becoming carefully neutral. There'd been an incident, she mentioned vaguely, something about inappropriate relationships with patients. The hospital had hushed it up to avoid scandal, but everyone knew Sloane had been asked to leave. She'd been brilliant with medications, the nurse added, knew more about drug interactions than some of the doctors. But there'd been questions about patients becoming unexpectedly dependent on medications, about consent, and boundaries being crossed. The nurse caught herself, seeming to remember I was listening, and quickly excused herself. Sloane's face had gone pale during the nurse's reminiscence, her fingers tightening on Vernon's hand until her knuckles went white. She tried to laugh it off, saying the nurse must be confusing her with someone else, but the damage was done. I'd seen the truth in her reaction, the fear that her past was catching up with her. Vernon, whether genuinely confused or playing along, mumbled something about Sloane being the best daughter anyone could ask for. The words sounded rehearsed, like lines they'd practiced for moments when their relationship might be questioned. But the way he looked at her when he said it, with heat and hunger barely concealed by his supposed grogginess, told a different story entirely. As evening approached, I made my excuses to leave, saying I needed to handle some business matters related to the sale of my company. Sloane barely acknowledged my departure, too focused on Vernon to maintain her usual perfect daughter-in-law routine. At the elevator, I encountered Doctor again. She pulled me aside, her expression grave. The toxicology report had revealed something disturbing. Along with the massive dose of lorazepam, they'd found traces of other medications in Vernon's system. Antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, a cocktail of drugs that suggested long-term manipulation of brain chemistry. Someone had been medicating Vernon for years, she said, creating a chemical dependence that would make him vulnerable to manipulation. The same patterns, she added quietly, that she'd seen in cases of elderly abuse where caregivers slowly poisoned their victims while maintaining complete control. The drive home gave me time to process what I'd learned. Sloane wasn't just poisoning Mitchell and attempting to poison me for money. There was something deeper, more twisted at play. Vernon's mention of Margaret, his wife who'd died 5 years ago of supposed heart failure, suddenly took on new significance. What if Margaret had discovered something about Vernon and Sloane's relationship? What if her death wasn't natural at all, but the first murder in a series that was supposed to culminate with Mitchell and me? The pieces were forming a picture so dark I could barely bring myself to look at it directly. A father and daughter, bound by something unspeakable, slowly eliminating anyone who stood between them and their sick version of happiness. That evening, I went through photo albums from the past 10 years, looking at family gatherings with new eyes. There they were at Christmas 5 years ago, just months after Margaret's death, standing closer together than mourners should. At Mitchell and Sloane's 5th anniversary party, Vernon's hand on Sloane's lower back, possessive and intimate. At every family vacation, every holiday, every celebration, they were always positioned as a unit, with Mitchell on the periphery, confused and docile. The evidence had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, disguised as a close father-daughter relationship that no one would question. But knowing what I knew now, the truth screamed from every photograph. I found Margaret's obituary online, reading it carefully for the first time. Sudden cardiac arrest at age 57, no autopsy performed at the family's request. Vernon, identified as the grieving widower, had handled all the arrangements. Sloane, the devoted daughter, had been by his side throughout. The memorial service had been small, private, family only. Looking at the date, I realized it was exactly 1 week before Vernon and Sloane had taken their first healing vacation together, a month-long trip to Costa Rica, where they'd supposedly grieved and bonded over their loss. But now I wondered what had really happened on that trip. What lines had finally been crossed once Margaret's watchful presence was permanently removed? The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted my research. Sloane had returned from the hospital, using her key to let herself in, as she'd done hundreds of times before. But tonight, the familiar sound felt like an invasion. I listened to her footsteps on the stairs, heard her stop at Mitchell's room, checking on him as she did every night. Then her steps continued to the guest room where she stayed when it was too late to drive home. I wondered how many times she'd drugged my son after checking on him, how many doses of poison disguised as loving care she'd administered over the years. Tomorrow, I decided I would hire a private investigator. Tonight had given me pieces of the puzzle, but I needed the whole picture before I could act. Vernon's overdose was an accident, a twist of fate that had revealed their hand. Now it was time to play my own. The private investigator came recommended by my lawyer, a former FBI agent who specialized in family matters that required discretion. We met at a coffee shop in White Plains, far enough from my usual haunts that no one would recognize me. I laid out what I knew: the switched glasses, the strange relationship between Sloane and Vernon, Mitchell's deteriorating condition, and Margaret's suspicious death 5 years ago. The investigator listened without judgment, taking notes in a small leather notebook, occasionally asking for clarification. He'd seen worse, he told me, families hiding secrets that would make my suspicions seem tame by comparison. But there was something in his eyes when I described the way Vernon looked at Sloane, the way she touched him when she thought no one was watching. Even for someone who'd seen it all, this case had a particular darkness to it. The investigator started his investigation immediately, beginning with public records and working his way into more sensitive territory. Within 3 days, he had preliminary findings that made my blood run cold. Vernon and Sloane had been taking annual vacations together since Margaret's death, always to remote locations, always booking single rooms with king beds. The paper trail was careful, but not careful enough for someone who knew what to look for. Credit card records showed purchases of lingerie and jewelry that Vernon had supposedly given his daughter as gifts. Restaurant receipts from romantic dinners for two at couples resorts where they'd registered under different last names. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning when taken as a whole. No father and daughter vacationed like this, not unless their relationship had crossed into territory that defied every natural boundary. Meanwhile, I started paying closer attention to patterns I'd previously ignored. Every morning, Sloane arrived at exactly 7:30 to prepare Mitchell's breakfast and my tea. She insisted on using special herbs she grew herself, claiming they had medicinal properties that would help with energy and focus. Mitchell drank his without question, the routine so established that he reached for his cup before his eyes were fully open. I'd been drinking mine too, though less consistently, often forgetting when I got caught up in morning calls with my business partners. That inconsistency might have saved me from Mitchell's fate. Looking back, I could track my worst days, the ones where confusion and dizziness plagued me, to mornings when I'd actually finished the entire cup of Sloane's special brew. The kitchen had become Sloane's domain over the years, and I realized now how strategic that takeover had been. She controlled what we ate, what we drank, had access to every dish and cup before it reached our lips. The spice rack had been reorganized her way, with unlabeled jars she claimed were exotic seasonings from specialty shops. The refrigerator was always stocked with her homemade tonics and health drinks that she encouraged us to consume for our well-being. Even the water filter had been replaced with one she'd researched and installed herself, claiming the standard one wasn't removing enough toxins. But what if it wasn't about removing toxins at all? What if it was about adding them, creating a delivery system that would allow her to medicate an entire household without anyone suspecting? I found Mitchell's medical records from the past decade, a thick file documenting his decline from brilliant attorney to someone who could barely function without constant supervision. The symptoms had started subtly about a year after he married Sloane. Occasional forgetfulness that everyone attributed to stress, difficulty concentrating during important meetings, hands that shook when he tried to sign documents. The progression had been so gradual that each new symptom seemed like a natural evolution of the last. Doctors had run tests, MRIs, blood work, cognitive assessments, but found no clear cause. They'd suggested everything from early-onset dementia to chronic fatigue syndrome, but nothing quite fit. Now I understood why. The poison was being carefully calibrated, adjusted to create symptoms without leaving obvious traces that standard medical tests would detect. The investigator called with more information about Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital, where Sloane had worked. Through his contacts, he'd gotten access to sealed personnel files that painted a disturbing picture. Sloane had been a psychiatric nurse with an exceptional understanding of psychotropic medications. Her supervisors had initially praised her dedication to patient care, particularly with elderly male patients who seemed to respond well to her attention. But then irregularities started appearing. Patients under her care developed unusual dependencies, not just on medications, but on Sloane herself. They would become agitated when she wasn't on shift, refuse medication from other nurses, and show signs of cognitive decline that didn't match their original diagnoses. The final straw had been a patient named William Morrison, a 62-year-old man with mild anxiety who'd developed an obsessive attachment to Sloane. When investigators looked deeper, they found he'd changed his will to leave everything to her, just weeks before dying of an unexpected heart attack. The parallels to Margaret's death were impossible to ignore. I pulled out photo albums from 6 years ago, before Margaret died, studying them with fresh eyes. She looked healthy, vibrant, a woman in her 50s who took care of herself and had no history of heart problems. But in the last photos, taken just months before her death, something had changed. The same glassy look I now saw in Mitchell's eyes, the same slight tremor in her hands, the same confusion caught in candid moments when she thought no one was watching. Had Sloane been practicing on her mother-in-law before moving on to Mitchell? Or had this been Vernon's idea, eliminating his wife so he could be with his daughter without the complication of a marriage that had probably been dead long before Margaret herself was? The investigator had also been tracking Vernon's history, and what he found added another layer to the horror. Vernon's pharmacy license had been quietly revoked 15 years ago after allegations of inappropriate prescribing practices. He'd been giving controlled substances to young women without proper documentation, including one woman who'd overdosed and nearly died. That woman, the investigator discovered through painstaking research, had been a 19-year-old named Rebecca, who looked remarkably like Sloane. The same delicate features, the same honey-colored hair, the same green eyes. The implications made me nauseous. Had Vernon been attracted to his own daughter even then? Had he been using substitutes until Sloane was old enough to manipulate? The timeline was suspicious. The license revocation happened when Sloane was 19, right around the time she would have been becoming a woman who looked disturbingly like the girls Vernon had been inappropriately medicating. I decided to search the house more thoroughly while Sloane was at the hospital with Vernon. Her room, which she used during overnight stays, seemed normal at first glance. But hidden in the back of the closet, I found a lockbox she'd apparently forgotten about. Inside were documents that made everything clear. Love letters, though unsigned, in Vernon's distinctive handwriting. Photos from their vacations that no father and daughter should have taken. And most damning, a journal where Sloane had documented her treatment plan for Mitchell. Every dose, every adjustment, every observed effect meticulously recorded like a science experiment. The entries went back 10 years, starting just after their honeymoon. One entry from 5 years ago stood out. Margaret was becoming suspicious, it said. She'd confronted Vernon about the way he looked at Sloane. The solution, written in Sloane's neat handwriting, was elegant in its simplicity. Increase Margaret's beta blockers slowly over 6 months until her heart couldn't take the strain. The journal also contained references to someone called G, obviously me, with notes about beginning a similar protocol once the company sale was finalized. They'd been planning to have Mitchell declared incompetent, giving Sloane full control of his assets. Then, with me gone too, she would inherit everything as Mitchell's wife and my daughter-in-law. $23 million to fund a life where she and Vernon could disappear to some country where no one would question their relationship. The entries showed careful planning, patience, and a complete absence of conscience. They weren't just lovers, they were predators who'd turned my family into prey. The fact that they were father and daughter added a level of depravity that made their financial motivations seem almost secondary to the sickness of their bond. Celeste called that evening with concerns about Mitchell. She'd taken him to lunch, and he'd broken down crying, saying he felt like he was losing his mind. He couldn't remember things that had happened yesterday, but could recall with perfect clarity events from before his marriage. It was as if the last 10 years were being systematically erased from his brain, while older memories remained intact. She wanted to take him to a specialist in Boston, someone outside Sloane's network of doctors who might look at his case with fresh eyes. I encouraged her to do it immediately, to take Mitchell and leave town without telling Sloane. The less his wife knew about his whereabouts, the safer he would be. Celeste heard something in my voice that made her stop asking questions and simply agree. She'd learned to trust my instincts during our marriage, even when she didn't understand them. That night, I watched from my study window as Sloane's car pulled into the driveway. She moved differently now, less assured, more watchful. Vernon's overdose had shaken her carefully constructed world. She didn't know how much I knew, but she sensed the dynamic had shifted. Instead of coming directly inside, she stood in the garden for a long moment, looking up at the house as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps for the last time. When she finally entered, I heard her moving through the rooms, checking things, looking for signs of disturbance. She was spooked, and spooked people made mistakes. I needed her to make one that would expose everything they'd done, not just to me, but to the world. The public humiliation of their sick secret would be worse than any prison sentence. The investigator sent me footage from a private security camera at one of the hotels where Vernon and Sloane had stayed. The owner owed him a favor and had pulled archived footage from 2 years ago. What I saw confirmed everything. They walked hand in hand through the lobby, Vernon's arm around Sloane's waist in a way that screamed possession. In the elevator, thinking they were alone, they kissed. Not a father's peck on his daughter's cheek, but a deep, passionate kiss that made me turn away from the screen in disgust. This was evidence that would destroy them both. But I needed more. I needed proof of the murders, the poisonings, the systematic destruction of my son's brilliant mind. The journal was good, but a clever lawyer might argue it was fantasy, a disturbed woman's private thoughts never meant to be acted upon. I needed them to incriminate themselves beyond any doubt. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Vernon was being released from the hospital, still weak but stable enough for home care. Sloane announced she would be staying at our house for a few days to care for both Mitchell and her father, bringing Vernon here where she could monitor both of them. It was a bold move, bringing her accomplice and lover into the heart of the territory they'd been slowly conquering. But it also showed their desperation. They knew their plan was unraveling, and they needed to accelerate things before they lost control completely. I agreed, playing the concerned father and father-in-law, while secretly installing recording devices in the guest rooms where they'd be staying. If they thought they were safe in my house, they might let their guard down enough to reveal the full truth of their crimes. As I prepared for their arrival, I found one more piece of evidence that chilled me to the bone. Hidden in Mitchell's home office was a life insurance policy I'd never seen before, taken out 5 years ago, just after Margaret's death. The beneficiary was Sloane, and the amount was substantial, $20 million. But the truly disturbing part was the clause about mental incompetence. If Mitchell was declared mentally unfit before his death, the payout would double. They hadn't just been poisoning him, they'd been setting up a financial windfall that would trigger whether he died or simply lost his mind completely. The signature on the policy looked like Mitchell's, but knowing what I knew now about his condition at the time, I doubted he'd been competent to sign anything. This was forgery on top of murder, fraud on top of poisoning, a web of crimes all stemming from a relationship so twisted it defied comprehension. Vernon arrived at my house in a wheelchair, still pale from his ordeal, but with eyes that sparkled with something unsettling when they landed on Sloane. She fussed over him with the dedication of a devoted daughter, adjusting his blanket, checking his pulse, her hands lingering on his skin longer than necessary. The spare bedroom had been converted into a makeshift recovery room, medical equipment that Sloane had somehow procured filling the space. She was efficient, professional, moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. As she helped Vernon from the wheelchair to the bed, their bodies pressed together for a moment, and I saw him inhale deeply, breathing her in like an addict getting a fix. The recording devices I'd hidden would capture everything, but watching it in person made my skin crawl with a revulsion I struggled to hide. The investigator had been thorough in his investigation, uncovering details that painted an even darker picture than I'd imagined. Vernon's first wife, Sloane's biological mother, had died when Sloane was 16. The death certificate listed complications from diabetes, but the investigator found irregularities in the medical records. The woman had no prior history of diabetes, no family history, nothing that would explain the sudden onset of a disease that killed her within months. The attending physician had noted his confusion in private notes that never made it into the official report. He'd suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove it. Vernon had been the one administering her insulin, claiming she was too weak to do it herself. The parallels to Margaret's death were unmistakable. Vernon had been killing wives, and Sloane had learned from the master, graduating from student to accomplice, to full partner in their twisted dance of death and desire. The first night they stayed in my house revealed more than hours of investigation could have uncovered. The recording devices picked up everything, their whispered conversations when they thought I was asleep, the sound of footsteps moving between rooms in the dark. Around 2 a.m, Sloane entered Vernon's room and didn't leave until just before dawn. Their voices were muffled, but the emotion in them was clear. Vernon calls her his special girl, his everything, words that no father should speak to his daughter with such passion. Sloane responded with equal fervor, talking about their future, their plans, how soon they could leave everything behind. They discussed increasing my dosage, making it look like the stress of Mitchell's condition had caused a stroke or heart attack. The calculation in their voices was chilling, discussing my death like a business transaction while lying in bed together in my own home. Mitchell's absence hadn't gone unnoticed by Sloane. She'd called him repeatedly, growing increasingly agitated when he didn't answer. I told her Celeste had taken him to see specialists in Boston, which was partially true. What I didn't tell her was that Celeste had actually taken him to a private medical facility that specialized in detoxification from long-term poisoning. The initial blood work had revealed traces of at least 7 different psychotropic drugs in his system, layered and combined in ways that would cause exactly the symptoms he'd been experiencing. The doctors were amazed he was still functional at all. Most patients with that level of chemical manipulation would be completely catatonic. Mitchell's natural resilience had saved him from complete destruction, though the damage might still be permanent. The medical team promised to document everything, creating a paper trail that would be crucial for the legal case I was building. During the day, I played the role of the concerned patriarch, checking on Vernon's recovery, thanking Sloane for her dedication to our family. The performance was exhausting but necessary. I needed them to feel secure, to believe their plan was still on track despite the setback of Vernon's overdose. Sloane prepared meals with her usual attention to detail, and I noticed she was particularly insistent that I eat everything she served. The food tasted different now that I knew what she was capable of, every bite potentially containing something designed to cloud my mind or stop my heart. I developed strategies to avoid consuming her poisons, palming pills she handed me for supposed headaches, pouring drinks into plants when she wasn't looking, replacing her preparations with my own when possible. It was a delicate game, maintaining the illusion while protecting myself from their slow murder. The investigator uncovered something extraordinary in his research into Vernon and Sloane's past. There had been another family member, Vernon's mother, who had lived with them briefly when Sloane was 18. She'd lasted exactly 3 months before dying in what was reported as an accidental fall down the stairs. But the elderly woman had been in excellent health, living independently before moving in with her son and granddaughter. Neighbors remembered her expressing concerns about Vernon and Sloane's closeness, how unnatural it seemed, how uncomfortable it made her. She'd even told one friend she was thinking of calling social services, worried that something inappropriate was happening. Then she was dead, her concerns buried with her. The pattern was clear. Anyone who threatened to expose their secret ended up dead, victims of accidents or sudden illnesses that no one questioned because Vernon and Sloane were such devoted caregivers. The dynamics between Vernon and Sloane became more blatant as they settled into my house. When they thought I was in my study on business calls, they would sit together in the living room. Sloane curled against Vernon's side like a lover rather than a daughter. Their conversations were intimate, filled with inside jokes and shared memories that had nothing to do with normal family experiences. They talked about their vacations with a wistfulness that spoke of romantic getaways rather than father-daughter bonding trips. Vernon would stroke Sloane's hair while she read to him from medical journals about new drugs and their effects, their shared interest in pharmacology serving as both professional collaboration and grotesque foreplay. The recording devices captured it all, hours of evidence that would destroy any jury's ability to see them as anything other than the monsters they were. I discovered that Sloane had been accessing my financial accounts through Mitchell's computer, using passwords he'd apparently shared with her during his confused states. She'd been monitoring the $73 million transaction, tracking where the money was held, preparing for the moment when she could claim it all. There were drafted emails to lawyers about having Mitchell declared incompetent, citing his deteriorating condition and the need for someone to manage his affairs. Other drafts discussed my own supposed decline, setting up a narrative where both Mitchell and I were victims of hereditary dementia that required Sloane to take control of the family fortune. The premeditation was stunning. Every angle considered, every contingency planned for except one. She never imagined that someone might discover her secret before her plan was complete. The investigator brought me footage from traffic cameras and ATM machines near the hotels where Vernon and Sloane had stayed during their trips. The images were damning, showing them entering and leaving at all hours, always together, always touching. In one particularly clear photo from a beach resort in Mexico, they were kissing on what they thought was a private balcony, not realizing a traffic camera across the street had captured the moment. The timestamp showed this was 3 years after Margaret's death, 2 years into their grieving process that had brought them closer together. There were receipts for couples massages, romantic dinners, even a jewelry store purchase of matching rings that they wore on chains around their necks, hidden under their clothes, but visible in moments when they thought no one was watching. The 4th night of their stay, I witnessed something that confirmed every terrible suspicion. Unable to sleep, I'd gone to the kitchen for water around 3 in the morning. The house was dark, but I heard sounds from the living room. Moving carefully, I peered around the corner to see Vernon and Sloane on the couch, entangled in a way that made my stomach turn. They were so lost in each other they didn't notice me watching, didn't hear the soft click of my phone's camera as I documented their depravity. This wasn't just evidence of an inappropriate relationship. This was proof of the active, ongoing incest that motivated their murders. They whispered between kisses about their love, their plans, how Margaret and soon I would be nothing but bad memories they'd left behind. Sloane mentioned something about increasing the dose in tomorrow morning's tea, and Vernon agreed it was time to accelerate things. The next morning, I watched Sloane prepare breakfast with a new understanding of her methods. She worked with the precision of a chemist, measuring ingredients carefully, adding drops of clear liquid from a small bottle she kept in her pocket. The tea she prepared for me was treated with special attention, stirred counterclockwise exactly 7 times, a ritual that probably ensured even distribution of whatever poison she'd added. When she served it to me with her usual warm smile, I saw the calculation behind her eyes, the anticipation of another successful dose delivered to an unsuspecting victim. I thanked her, praised the aroma, and waited until she turned away to pour the entire cup into a thermos I'd hidden under the table. Later, I would have it tested, adding to the mountain of evidence against her. That afternoon, while Sloane was giving Vernon what she called physical therapy, but looked more like an intimate massage, the investigator called with urgent news. He'd found Rebecca, the young woman Vernon had nearly killed with inappropriate prescriptions 15 years ago. She was willing to talk, and her story was horrifying. Vernon had been her psychiatrist when she was 19, the same age Sloane was then. He'd become obsessed with her, calling her special, saying she reminded him of someone he loved. He'd drugged her during sessions, done things she could barely remember, but that left her feeling violated and confused. When she tried to report him, he'd increased her medications until she nearly died from an overdose. The medical board had quietly revoked his license, but criminal charges were never filed. She'd spent years in therapy trying to understand what had happened to her, and now she realized she'd been a surrogate for his sick attraction to his own daughter. The investigation also revealed financial irregularities that added another dimension to their crimes. Vernon had been deeply in debt before Margaret's death, his pharmacy consulting business failing after his license revocation. But immediately after Margaret's funeral, he'd paid off everything and started living well beyond his apparent means. The money trail led back to Margaret's life insurance and retirement accounts, all of which had been changed to benefit Vernon just months before her death. The changes had been made when Margaret was already showing signs of cognitive decline, the same symptoms Mitchell exhibited now. They'd tested their methods on her, refined their approach, then used the perfected technique on Mitchell while planning to eventually use it on me. Each death funded the next phase of their plan, a self-perpetuating cycle of murder for profit and perverted love. I found myself studying Vernon during dinner that evening, trying to understand how a father could look at his daughter and feel what he clearly felt for Sloane. He watched her constantly, his eyes following her every movement with a hunger that had nothing to do with paternal affection. When she served him food, their fingers would touch and linger. When she adjusted his pillows, she would lean close enough for him to smell her hair, and I could see him close his eyes in pleasure. They'd forgotten to be careful, maybe thinking I was too preoccupied with Mitchell's absence to notice, or maybe the close call with death had made them reckless. Either way, they were exposing themselves more with each passing hour, and the recording devices were capturing everything. The investigator had one more bombshell to deliver. Through his law enforcement contacts, he'd obtained DNA evidence from a cold case in Pennsylvania where a young woman had been found dead in circumstances similar to Margaret's death. The woman had been a patient at a clinic where Vernon had worked before moving to New York. She'd been 24, pretty, with green eyes like Sloane's. The DNA found at the scene had never been matched to anyone in the system, but the investigator had a friend run an unofficial comparison. It was Vernon's. The case had been ruled a suicide, the woman supposedly taking an overdose of her prescribed medications, but the scene had never felt right to the investigating detective. Now we knew why. Vernon had been killing young women who looked like his daughter for years, practicing for the day when he could have Sloane herself. That night, I made a decision. The evidence was overwhelming, but I wanted more than just their arrest. I wanted them to confess, to be exposed publicly for the monsters they were. I wanted the world to see what they'd done to my family, to understand the depth of their depravity. Tomorrow, I would set a trap that would force them to reveal themselves, to admit their crimes in front of witnesses who could never unsee what they were about to learn. The thought of what was coming made me sick with anticipation and dread. My family had been destroyed by these two predators, but tomorrow, I would begin the process of destroying them in return. The $73 million they'd killed for would become the bait in a trap they'd never see coming. The invitation went out to select family members and close friends, framed as a celebration of Vernon's recovery and a chance to discuss Mitchell's treatment options. I chose the guests carefully, people who needed to witness what was about to unfold, including Judge Harrison, an old friend whose presence would add legal weight to whatever happened. My lawyer would be there too, along with the doctor from the hospital, Celeste, and surprisingly, Mitchell himself. He'd returned from Boston that morning, still fragile, but lucid enough to understand what was happening. The detox had cleared some of the fog from his mind, though the damage was far from healed. When he saw Sloane, something flickered in his eyes. Not love, but confusion, as if he was seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. She tried to embrace him, but he pulled back instinctively, his body remembering danger even if his mind couldn't fully grasp it. The dining room was set for an elegant dinner, crystal and silver gleaming under the chandelier, everything perfect for what would be the last meal Vernon and Sloane would eat as free people. I'd had the wine specially selected, making sure to pour it myself, maintaining control of every glass. The recording devices were all active, but tonight I'd also arranged for something more obvious. My lawyer had brought a court reporter, explaining to the guests that we needed to document discussions about Mitchell's medical care for insurance purposes. Sloane tensed when she saw the stenographer setting up, but Vernon touched her hand under the table, a gesture meant to calm her that only confirmed their intimacy to anyone watching closely. Judge Harrison noticed, his eyebrows raising slightly, the first crack in the facade they'd maintained for so long. Conversation started normally, discussing Vernon's recovery, Mitchell's condition, the challenges of caring for family members with health issues. Sloane played her role perfectly. the devoted wife concerned about her husband's well-being, the loving daughter caring for her father. But there was a tremor in her voice when she spoke about Mitchell's treatment, a hesitation when asked about his medications. Doctor asked specific questions about the drugs Mitchell had been taking, and Sloane's answers were evasive, claiming she couldn't remember exact names or dosages. Strange for someone who'd been so meticulous in administering them. The doctor's expression grew increasingly skeptical as Sloane fumbled through explanations that didn't match the symptoms she'd previously reported. I waited until the main course was served before beginning my performance. Standing to make a toast, I thanked everyone for coming, for supporting our family through difficult times. Then I turned to the subject of Margaret, Vernon's late wife, mentioning how much she was missed, how tragic her sudden death had been. Vernon's face went pale, his hand tightening on his wine glass until I thought it might shatter. Sloane started to speak, but I continued, talking about how Margaret had confided in me before she died, how she'd been worried about certain things she'd observed. The room grew quiet, everyone sensing the shift in atmosphere, the undercurrent of something dark approaching the surface. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his legal instincts alert to the tension building around the table. I produced Margaret's diary, one the investigator had recovered from a safety deposit box Margaret had secretly maintained. Reading from it, I shared Margaret's growing fears about Vernon and Sloane's relationship, her observations of their inappropriate closeness, the way they would look at each other when they thought no one was watching. Sloane stood abruptly, claiming I was misinterpreting an innocent father-daughter bond, but her protest sounded hollow. Vernon remained frozen, his eyes locked on the diary as if it were a ghost returning to haunt him. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one left. They were witnessing something terrible and couldn't look away, drawn by the same dark fascination that makes people slow down at accident scenes. The diary entries grew more explicit as I continued reading. Margaret had found them together one night, not quite catching them in the act, but close enough to know something was deeply wrong. She'd confronted Vernon, threatened to call the police, to have Sloane removed from the house. The next day, Margaret had started feeling ill, the beginning of the 6-month decline that ended in her death. I looked directly at Vernon as I read this part, watching him shrink into his chair like a man watching his execution approach. Sloane reached for his hand, forgetting their audience, the gesture so automatic and intimate that gasps went around the table. Even those who'd been skeptical couldn't deny what they were seeing, the unconscious intimacy of lovers rather than father and daughter. Doctor interrupted to share her own findings, explaining that the toxicology report from Vernon's overdose had revealed something interesting. The drugs in his system matched exactly the cocktail found in Mitchell's blood work from Boston, a specific combination that would require extensive pharmaceutical knowledge to create. She looked pointedly at Sloane, who had that exact knowledge from her time at Willowbrook. The doctor then dropped her biggest revelation. She'd tested samples of Mitchell's hair, which showed a timeline of poisoning going back years, with increasing doses that correlated precisely with his declining mental state. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was medical evidence of systematic poisoning that had destroyed my son's brilliant mind, drop by drop, dose by dose. Mitchell himself spoke then, his voice stronger than it had been in months. The clarity in his eyes was painful to see, the fog lifting enough for him to understand what had been done to him. He talked about the teas Sloane made him drink every morning, how she would watch to make sure he finished every drop, the vitamins she insisted he take, counting them out herself, never letting him handle his own medications, how his worst days always followed nights when Sloane had been particularly attentive, bringing him special drinks to help him sleep. The betrayal in his voice was heartbreaking. The realization that the woman he'd loved and trusted had been slowly murdering him for years. Celeste reached over to hold his hand, tears streaming down her face as she listened to our son describe his own poisoning. My lawyer then presented documents he'd discovered through his own investigation, power of attorney papers that Mitchell had supposedly signed, but the signatures were clearly forged when compared to authentic samples. Insurance policies taken out in Mitchell's name with Sloan as beneficiary, policies Mitchell had no memory of agreeing to. Bank accounts that had been opened using Mitchell's information but that only Sloan could access, already containing transfers from his personal accounts made during his most confused periods. The financial web they'd woven was extensive, designed to strip Mitchell and me of everything while making it look legal. But the forgeries were obvious once examined closely, the work of people who'd gotten overconfident in their scheme. I turned to Vernon then, asking him directly about his relationship with his daughter. He tried to maintain the fiction, claiming I was insane, that grief over Mitchell's condition had driven me to see conspiracies where none existed. But his voice shook, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. Sloan tried to support his denial, but their stories didn't align. She said they'd never traveled alone together. He admitted to a few trips, but claimed they were for grieving. She said Margaret's death was sudden. He said it had been a long illness. The contradictions piled up, each one further proof that they were lying, that they couldn't keep their stories straight under pressure. Judge Harrison asked to see the diary, reading it himself with the careful attention of someone used to evaluating evidence. His expression grew grimmer with each page, occasionally glancing at Vernon and Sloan with undisguised disgust. When he reached the entry where Margaret had written about finding Vernon in Sloan's bed, he set the diary down and looked directly at them. The silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone waiting for someone to break, to confess, to end this horrible revelation. Vernon's breathing had become labored, his face flushed, and for a moment I thought he might have another overdose reaction. But this was pure panic, the realization that everything was crumbling around them. The investigator arrived then, as planned, bringing with him Rebecca, the woman Vernon had nearly killed 15 years ago. Her presence was like an electric shock through the room. Vernon's eyes went wide with recognition and fear. Rebecca stood straight, finding strength in finally facing her abuser. She told her story simply but powerfully. How Vernon had drugged her during therapy sessions, how he'd called her his special girl, the same term the recordings had captured him using with Sloan, how he'd whispered about someone he loved but couldn't have, someone who was so close but untouchable. Now she understood he'd been talking about his own daughter, using her as a surrogate for his sick desires. The parallel was undeniable, and even Sloan couldn't maintain her composure as she heard how her father had practiced his perversions on other women. The court reporter captured every word, creating an official record of the accusations and evidence being presented. My lawyer had made sure everything was legally admissible, that this dinner party was actually a carefully orchestrated legal trap. Judge Harrison's presence meant that anything said could be used in future proceedings, and his position gave weight to the witnesses' testimonies. When he asked Sloan directly if she had been poisoning Mitchell, she looked around the table at the faces watching her, waiting for her answer. Her mask finally cracked completely. She laughed, a bitter sound that sent chills through everyone present. Then she started talking, and once she started, she couldn't stop. She admitted to the poisoning, but claimed it was Vernon's idea, that he'd taught her everything when she was just a teenager, that he'd been touching her since she was 14, telling her she was special, that their love was pure and beyond society's understanding, that he'd killed her mother when she was 16 because the woman had tried to keep them apart, that Margaret had been a problem too, always watching, always suspicious, so they'd removed her just like they'd removed his mother when she'd threatened to expose them. The confessions poured out like poison from a lanced wound, each revelation more horrible than the last. Vernon tried to stop her, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away violently. If she was going down, she was taking him with her. Vernon's denials became increasingly desperate as Sloane revealed more details. She talked about their trips together, the hotels where they'd stayed as husband and wife, the plans they'd made to disappear once they had my money. She described how they'd decided Mitchell needed to be eliminated, how they'd tested different drug combinations to find the perfect mix that would destroy his mind without killing him too quickly, how they'd planned to do the same to me, but more aggressively once the $73 million was accessible. She pulled out the small bottle from her pocket, the one she'd been using to dose my tea, and threw it on the table. The liquid inside glowed faintly under the chandelier light. Innocuous looking, but deadly. The doctor immediately secured it as evidence. The room erupted then, everyone talking at once, the horror of what they'd heard overwhelming social propriety. Judge Harrison was on his phone, calling the police, ensuring they would arrive prepared for what they'd find. My lawyer was documenting everything, making notes for the criminal case that would follow. Celeste held Mitchell as he sobbed, the full weight of his wife's betrayal finally hitting him. But through it all, I watched Vernon and Sloane. They sat at opposite ends of the table now, their elaborate scheme in ruins, their sick love exposed to the world. Vernon looked broken, aged 20 years in 20 minutes. But Sloane's expression was different. There was relief there, as if the burden of keeping their secret had finally been lifted. When the police arrived, Sloane went quietly, but not before turning to Vernon one last time. "I did love you," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "More than any daughter should love her father." That was our curse. Vernon broke down completely then, sobbing as the officers cuffed him, begging Sloane to recant, to say she was lying. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses unimpeachable, and their own words had condemned them. As they were led away separately, I heard Vernon call out to her one last time, calling her his special girl, his everything. Even facing prison, possibly for life, he couldn't let go of his obsession with his own daughter. It was the final proof, if any was needed, of the sickness that had destroyed so many lives. The guests dispersed quickly after the arrest, unable to process what they'd witnessed. Judge Harrison assured me the case would be handled properly, that Vernon and Sloane would face justice for their crimes. Doctor took the poison bottle for analysis, promising to document exactly what they'd been using to destroy Mitchell's mind. My lawyer began preparing the legal proceedings that would nullify any claim Sloane might have to Mitchell's assets or mine. But as the house emptied and quiet returned, I found myself alone with Mitchell and Celeste in the dining room, where it had all unfolded. The beautiful table setting seemed obscene now. The crystal and silver witnesses to a confession of incest and murder that would haunt everyone who'd heard it. The morning after the dinner party brought a media storm that none of us could have anticipated. Someone at the party, perhaps one of the servers or the court reporter, had leaked the story to the press. By dawn, news vans lined our street, reporters desperate for details about the father-daughter lovers who'd murdered for money. The headlines were sensational, focusing on the incest angle with the kind of salacious detail that sells papers and drives clicks. Mitchell hadn't slept, spending the night vomiting as his body continued to purge the poisons Sloane had fed him for a decade. But it wasn't just physical sickness. The psychological trauma of learning his wife had been slowly killing him, while sleeping with her own father was destroying him in ways no medicine could heal. Celeste stayed with him, holding him through the worst of it, being the mother he needed when his world had collapsed entirely. The investigator arrived early with more evidence he'd compiled overnight, including video footage from the hidden cameras I'd installed. The recordings were extensive, showing Vernon and Sloane in moments of intimacy that left no doubt about their relationship. There were conversations about their plans, discussions of dosages and timing, arguments about whether to kill me quickly or slowly. In one particularly chilling exchange, Sloane worried that Mitchell was declining too fast, that people would notice. Vernon had calmed her, saying no one questions a grieving wife, that tears hide all sins. They'd laughed then, a sound that made everyone who heard the recording feel sick. The investigator had also found more victims, other elderly patients from Vernon's past who'd died under suspicious circumstances, always leaving him something in their wills. The police had searched Vernon's house overnight and found what amounted to a pharmaceutical laboratory in his basement. Despite losing his license, he'd been manufacturing and mixing drugs for years, creating custom compounds designed to mimic various conditions. There were detailed notes about absorption rates, half-lives, interactions between different medications. It was the work of a brilliant but twisted mind, someone who'd turned his medical knowledge into a weapon. They found journals dating back 20 years, documenting his experiments first on patients, then on his wife, and finally achieving perfection with Margaret and Mitchell. One entry described giving his own mother increasing doses of blood thinners until she fell down the stairs, her death looking like an accident, but actually being a carefully orchestrated murder. Sloane's apartment yielded its own treasures of horror. Police found love letters between her and Vernon going back 15 years, starting when she was 19, but referencing events from when she was much younger. The progression was clear in the letters, from a young girl confused by her father's attention to a woman fully complicit in their relationship. There were photographs, too, images that no father and daughter should have taken, documenting their trips together, their private moments, their sick partnership. In her bedroom, they found a wedding dress she'd never worn for Mitchell, but receipts showed Vernon had bought it for her 5 years ago, right after Margaret died. She'd been his bride in everything but law, and they'd been planning to make it official once they had my money and could disappear. The prosecutor was known for her aggressive pursuit of complex cases, and she took this one personally. She came to the house to interview Mitchell and me, building the foundation for what would be a landmark case. She explained that Vernon and Sloane would be charged with multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, poisoning, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The incest charge, while morally reprehensible, was actually one of the lesser crimes given everything else they'd done. She was confident about convictions, especially with Sloane's confession at the dinner party and the mountain of physical evidence. The challenge would be ensuring they received appropriate sentences, making sure some clever defense attorney didn't find a way to minimize their crimes or paint them as victims of mental illness. Mitchell's medical records from Boston arrived, providing clinical documentation of his poisoning. The doctors there had identified specific brain damage caused by the long-term exposure to psychotropic drugs, damage that might never fully heal. His brilliant legal mind had been systematically destroyed, neural pathways disrupted, memories erased or scrambled. The report compared his brain scans to those of patients with severe dementia, showing similar patterns of deterioration, but in someone far too young for natural cognitive decline. The doctors estimated he'd lost 40 to 50% of his cognitive function. Maybe more. They could stop further damage, could help him recover some functionality, but the Mitchell who'd graduated from Harvard Law was gone forever, murdered slowly by the woman who'd promised to love and cherish him. I spent hours with the forensic accountants my lawyer had hired, tracing the financial web Vernon and Sloane had woven. They'd been siphoning money for years, small amounts that wouldn't be noticed, building their escape fund. The $73 million from my business sale had been their ultimate target, but they'd already stolen close to $2 million through various schemes. Forged checks, unauthorized transfers, insurance policies taken out without knowledge or consent. They'd been particularly clever about it, making it look like Mitchell's deteriorating condition was causing him to make poor financial decisions. Several large withdrawals had been made on days when Mitchell was documented as being particularly confused, creating an alibi for the thefts. But the forensic analysis showed the signatures were forgeries, the transfers made from IP addresses linked to Sloan's devices. The media coverage intensified as more details emerged. Talk shows debated how a father-daughter relationship could become so twisted. Criminal psychologists analyzed Vernon and Sloan's pathology on cable news. The story went international, with tabloids in multiple countries running lurid headlines about the American family destroyed by incest and greed. Our house became a tourist destination of sorts, with people driving by slowly, taking pictures, trying to glimpse the scene of such spectacular depravity. I had to hire security to keep reporters and gawkers away to give Mitchell some peace as he tried to recover. The attention was exhausting, but it also ensured that Vernon and Sloan couldn't escape justice. The whole world was watching, demanding they pay for their crimes. My lawyer coordinated with the prosecutor to ensure all the evidence was properly documented and admissible. The recordings from the dinner party were crucial, as they contained spontaneous confessions made in front of multiple credible witnesses. Judge Harrison provided a sworn statement about what he'd observed, his legal standing adding weight to the testimony. Doctors' medical evidence was meticulously organized, creating a timeline of poisoning that corresponded exactly with financial transactions and insurance policy changes. The case was becoming a textbook example of how to build an airtight prosecution. Law schools would probably study it for years, examining how greed and perversion led to such an elaborate murder plot. I visited Vernon in jail, needing to understand how a father could do what he'd done. He looked older, smaller, diminished without Sloan by his side. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears, but I felt no pity. He tried to explain, to make me understand what he called his special love for Sloan, how she was everything to him, how she understood him in ways no one else could. He claimed she'd seduced him, that he'd tried to resist, but she was too perfect, too much like her mother, but better. The delusion was complete. He genuinely believed their relationship was a romance rather than abuse, that the murders were justified to protect their love. When I asked about Margaret, about his own mother, about Mitchell, he showed no remorse, only regret that they'd been caught before completing their plan. Sloan had been placed in a different facility, and her attorney had already begun building an insanity defense based on her father's grooming and manipulation. But the prosecution had anticipated this, bringing in experts who testified that while Sloan might have been victimized as a child, her actions as an adult showed clear premeditation and understanding of right and wrong. The journal entries where she calculated dosages, planned murders, and discussed financial gains demonstrated she wasn't insane, but rather a calculating killer who happened to be in an incestuous relationship. The 5 years since Margaret's death showed a pattern of deliberate choices, not the actions of someone unable to control themselves or understand consequences. Mitchell attempted suicide 3 weeks after the dinner party, unable to live with the knowledge of what Sloan had done to him and with him. He'd found some of Vernon's leftover medications hidden in the house and taken them all, hoping to finish what Sloan had started. Celeste found him in time, and he was rushed to the hospital where they pumped his stomach and stabilized him. The suicide attempt actually provided more evidence for the prosecution, demonstrating the severe psychological damage the victims suffered. Mitchell was placed on psychiatric hold, beginning intensive therapy to deal with the trauma. The therapist said it would take years to process what had happened, if he ever fully could. Some betrayals are too fundamental to ever fully heal from. The trial date was set for 6 months out, giving both sides time to prepare for what would be a complex and emotionally charged case. The prosecutor warned me it would be brutal, that every detail would be exposed, that Vernon and Sloane's attorneys would try to make us look complicit or negligent. They would question why I hadn't noticed earlier, why I'd allowed Sloane such access to Mitchell, why I'd drunk the tea she prepared even after becoming suspicious. The victim blaming would be intense, designed to create reasonable doubt or at least minimize sentences. I would have to relive every moment, analyze every decision, justify every action or inaction. The prospect was exhausting, but I was determined to see it through. They'd destroyed my family for money and sick pleasure. The least I could do was ensure they paid the price. Rebecca agreed to testify about Vernon's past predatory behavior, showing the pattern that had culminated in his relationship with Sloane. Other victims came forward too, elderly patients and young women who'd been drugged and manipulated by Vernon over the years. The pattern was consistent and horrifying. He would identify vulnerable people, gain their trust, use his pharmaceutical knowledge to make them dependent on him, then take what he wanted, whether that was money, sex, or, in Sloane's case, both. The prosecutor built a narrative showing Vernon as a serial predator who'd groomed his own daughter to be both his victim and eventually his accomplice. It was a story that would resonate with any jury, especially when combined with the physical evidence and recorded confessions. Sloane tried to recant her confession, claiming she'd been coerced, that the dinner party had been a setup designed to pressure her into false admissions. But the recordings contradicted her claim, showing her speaking freely, even seeming relieved to finally tell the truth. Her attorney argued she was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, that years of abuse had warped her ability to distinguish right from wrong. But the prosecutor had her journals, showing clear planning, careful calculation, and full awareness that what she was doing was illegal. The entries about Margaret were particularly damning. She'd written about watching her mother-in-law die, about the satisfaction of removing an obstacle to her happiness with Vernon. No jury would see that as the writing of someone who didn't understand what they were doing. The pharmaceutical analysis of the poison Sloane had been using revealed a sophisticated cocktail designed to cause maximum damage with minimum detection. It contained elements that would break down quickly in the body, leaving traces that looked like naturally occurring chemicals unless someone knew exactly what to look for. The formula showed advanced knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology, the kind that came from years of study and experimentation. Vernon's basement laboratory had been the source, but Sloane had been the one to refine it, to adjust dosages based on her observations of Mitchell's reactions. They'd been a perfect team in the worst possible way, combining their knowledge and lack of conscience to create the ideal murder weapon. As the trial approached, Mitchell showed small signs of improvement. The continued detox and therapy were helping, though the damage remained extensive. He could remember our names now, could hold conversations for short periods, though he tired quickly and often lost his train of thought. The doctor said this might be his ceiling, that expecting more would be setting ourselves up for disappointment. My brilliant son had been reduced to someone who needed help with basic tasks, who couldn't practice law, who might never be able to live independently again. Sloane had stolen his future as surely as if she'd shot him, only she'd done it slowly, drop by drop, kiss by poisoned kiss. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. The $73 million that had been the target of their scheme now felt like blood money. I established a trust for Mitchell's care, ensuring he would have the best treatment for the rest of his life. Another portion went to establishing a foundation for victims of family violence and poisoning, helping others who'd suffered similar betrayals. The money that Vernon and Sloane had killed for would now be used to undo damage caused by people like them. It felt like the only appropriate use for wealth that had cost so much in human terms. Every dollar would be a reminder of what greed could drive people to do, even to those they claimed to love. 6 months later, Vernon died in prison. Heart attack, the official report said. The inmates had their own justice for men who touched their daughters. I felt nothing when I heard. No satisfaction, no relief. Just empty acknowledgement that one monster was gone. Sloane would face trial alone now, unable to blame her dead father for leading her astray. Mitchell lived in a care facility now, a place that looked more like a resort than a medical institution. On good days, he knew who I was. On bad days, he called for Sloane, cried about losing something he couldn't quite remember. The doctors said this was his reality now. My brilliant son, who'd argued cases before state supreme courts, now struggled to remember if he'd eaten breakfast. I visited every Sunday, bringing photos from before, trying to anchor him to better times. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings from the dinner party filled the courtroom with Sloane's confession. The jury saw the photos, the love letters, the wedding dress Vernon had bought her after Margaret died. They heard about Mitchell's systematic poisoning. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Life without parole. At sentencing, Sloane spoke about love. How Vernon had been everything to her. How she'd do it all again for those years with him. The judge cut her off, disgusted. As they led her away, she looked at me one last time. "Take care of Mitchell," she said, as if she still had the right to care about the man she'd slowly murdered. I sold the Westchester house, unable to live surrounded by memories of poisoned tea and family dinners that had been preparation for murder. The $73 million meant nothing now, except as a means to ensure Mitchell's care. I established a foundation for victims of family poisoning. Every family we helped felt like a small victory against Vernon and Sloane's legacy. On quiet evenings, I thought about missed signs, the confusion, the strange intensity between them, Margaret's sudden illness. All the pieces had been there, but I'd been too focused on building wealth to see the rot in my own family. The $73 million deal had been my greatest achievement and my greatest failure. The switched glasses that started everything seemed like a lifetime ago. That moment of instinct had saved my life and exposed theirs. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd drunk that champagne. Would I be dead? Would Mitchell be completely gone? The thought made me grateful for whatever guided my hand that night. I never remarried, never dated. How could I trust anyone after what Sloane had done? She'd played the perfect daughter-in-law for 10 years while slowly murdering my son. Every gesture of kindness had been calculated. The betrayal had broken something fundamental in my ability to believe in people's goodness. Mitchell had a moment of clarity on his 40th birthday. We were sitting in the garden when he suddenly gripped my hand. "Dad," he said, voice clear for the first time in months. "I'm sorry I brought her into our lives." I told him it wasn't his fault, but he shook his head. "I should have seen it. The way she looked at Vernon. I think part of me knew, but I loved her too much to see it." Then the clarity faded, and he was lost again. Looking back, I realized the switched glasses had been more than self-preservation. They'd been the universe correcting itself, making Vernon drink the poison meant for me. Every family has secrets, but ours had been hiding something so dark it nearly destroyed us all. The money they'd coveted was gone now, spread among Mitchell's care and various charities. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was what I could do with the ashes of our family. The broken glass from that night sits on my desk now, a reminder. Trust your instincts. Switch the glasses. Let the truth reveal itself. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal. If someone you love feels wrong, don't wait for proof that might come too late. What would you sacrifice to save your family from the monsters among them? Please share your thoughts below, and consider subscribing for more stories of triumph over tragedy.